Hello, welcome to Politics Hour International. We are back and we are ready to pick your brains, fill your thoughts, and deliver you the most up-to-date events happening right now. Today's show covers events this week that highlight conflicts and civil unrest in the world. From the football pitch to the US courtrooms to Myanmar and a roundup of Russia, we bring you reports today on all these matters. But first of all, here's the latest news.
Welcome to the Politics Hour's international team. Here's your headlines for today.
100 years born out of workers around here, and they're breaking away into a league without competition that they can't be relegated from. It's an absolute disgrace.
Now, what a crazy week it has been so far. Not just about several places in the world easing lockdown restrictions. There has been a lot of celebration in the atmosphere for people to finally have a pint, meet up with friends, go to the parks. But it seems the topic of COVID has now turned into chaos. The grass may be greener on the other side, but how is it in Europe?
This breakaway group of teams, this is, for me, a war on football. It's a disgrace. It's embarrassing, and it goes against everything that football's about. It's a closed shop for these bigwigs, and it's completely and utterly only about one thing, and that's money. The rich getting richer, and the others not even being considered.
12 of the major European clubs are looking to form a breakaway European Super League.
What do we want back?
Fans.
What is football? Nothing without the fans. And they're not even thinking about the fans.
Football is nothing without fans.
They want the fans to spend more money and travel further. This is all about, right, I don't care about anybody else about my pockets. Let's get some more money in there and we'll be okay. Forget them, forget the players, forget the staff, forget the fans. This is about me who wants more money. I think it's bang out of order.
I can't see it happening.
Less than 48 hours after the 12 founding members confirmed their plans to move away from UEFA's Champions League and redefine the structure of European football, all 6 English clubs, Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, Manchester United, Manchester City and Tottenham, were forced into an embarrassing climb down. The decision has sparked worldwide tension. Here's what many commentators have to say.
Just greediness, isn't it? Taking away what we've all lived for, and it's just greedy. We're not getting nothing from it. Do you know what I mean? It's just taking away everything we love.
I and a lot of other Chelsea fans, if they kick a single ball in the European Super League, that's it. That's it. And I don't think I need to really put it any more complex than that.
We're going to look at everything that we can do with the football authorities to make sure that this doesn't go ahead in the way that it's currently being proposed. I don't think that it is good news for fans. I don't think it's good news for football in this country. And look, don't forget, these clubs are not just great global brands. Of course they're great global brands. They're also clubs that have originated historically from their towns, from their cities, from their local communities. They should have a link with those fans and with the fan base in those communities. So it is very, very important that continues to be the case. I don't like the look of these proposals, and we'll be consulting about what we can do.
Barcelona and Real Madrid are the only clubs left standing after the Big Six lead exodus. The Caribbean island of St. Vincent has been rocked by a huge explosion as the La Soufriere volcano fired a huge plume of ash and hot gas into the skies. Officials said it was destroying everything in its path amid fears for the safety of some residents who have refused to obey orders to evacuate. The series of volcanic explosions of the last few days have disrupted food and freshwater supplies, wiping out forests and farmland.
I was inside sleeping. Well, it was the shake, I wake up, I say, what is this? Then after the shake now, the whole house come down one time.
Everyone panicking, everyone running up and down, you see people are crying, all like that. Everyone trying to get out. It was terrible.
Coconut trees break down. I'm talking about all the coconut trees, all. You see birds on the ground. Yeah, me I tell you, India no look nice.
St. Vincent, desperate for more international aid as volcanic threat remains, breaking news comes in that the UN seeks $29 million for St. Vincent amid volcanic eruption. PM Ralph Gonzalez said officials are still assessing the damage, but that rebuilding will run in the hundreds of millions of dollars. However, this has erupted anger across the globe for more aid and assistance to be done.
Calls into question really like what the point of the Commonwealth is in 2021 when the wealth isn't coming to the common people that need it right now. Like, you know, we have the Queen on our money, we are proud of that Commonwealth, but right now we're not seeing that support that we need.
Tensions continue to rise in Myanmar. Myanmar activists on Wednesday launched a blue shirt campaign to show solidarity with those who were detained for their involvement in anti-regime movements. Arrests, torture and forced disappearances have been taking place daily in Myanmar since the February the 1st military coup. People dressed in blue shirts on Wednesday posted selfie photos with a raising hand on which writes a name of a person who was tortured or killed during custody after being detained by the security forces for their anti-regime activities. The Myanmar military's crackdown on anti-coup protests has displaced close to 250,000 people. So far, Myanmar's military has shown little willingness to engage with its neighbours and no sign of wanting to talk to members of the government, accusing some of them of treason, which is punishable by death. Now, after a turbulent year it has been around the world, where the global pandemic on race has sparked tension internally within the system and externally on the streets. But today we can report that the verdict of George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man who was killed by former police officer Derek Chauvin, has been found guilty of all charges over Floyd's death. The jury returned guilty verdicts of second-degree murder, third-degree murder and manslaughter. President Joe Biden addressed the nation saying racism is a stain on the nation's soul. Barack and Michelle Obama welcomed the verdict but warned true justice is more than one trial. The former police officer was filmed kneeling on Floyd for over 9 minutes during his arrest last May. The chants of "I can't breathe" that spread shockwaves around the world. Finally, George Floyd's brother, in a tearful speech after the verdict, said, "We can finally breathe."
We won't be able to breathe until you're able to breathe. Today, we are able to breathe again.
That is all the news from us today. This is Politics Hour International. Now, following from the verdict of George Floyd's death, it is almost the anniversary of Floyd's death that took place on the 25th of May. Our correspondents Saffron and Fuad report further on this matter.
No peace! Police! No peace! Police! No peace!
In 2020, the entire world was shaken by the traumatic death of George Floyd. Protests in solidarity were popping up all over the world as millions were shocked by the injustice that's faced by so many Black Americans at the hand of police. Although this particular case is closed, it is emblematic of a far greater issue. In this brief fact check, Fuad and I will discuss some of the often repeated rhetorics regarding the issue and ask, has America finally learned its lesson?
I briefly talked to former photographer Phil O'Brien, who has captured historical events of race riots in the UK. Here's what he has to say.
You know, one of the issues was about the policing at the time. Could you say, is there anything you saw about that? And I'll answer it.
Okay, so policing at the time during the riots was a massive issue. Now, knowing that you live in New York, do you see any similarities or differences in the way the police act towards these communities?
Yeah, I think on the nights I was seeing, the policing in terms of those kind of what were violent situations. But what I learned afterwards, reading the reports, was just the disparity of the stop and plea, the stop and search at the time. And just the general kind of segregation and attitude of what was a predominantly white Liverpool police force. And, they talked about at the time institutional racism, which I was like, oh, was that political correctness or whatever? Go mad. Remember this 40 years ago. This isn't me now. And what's been interesting seeing is, and I know in the summer there were the Black Lives Matter protests all around the world, including Liverpool. And, in Liverpool, you would have probably seen policing on a very light touch. We understand this. Unfortunately, in America, I'm shocked by US policing, and particularly the NYPD. And well, actually the whole country, that the instance of George Floyd, it's backward. The police forces here, the policing of the Black Lives Matter protests in New York were disgraceful. It really was. That we see you as an alien force and we do not want this protest. And I'm glad to say that I think that has probably moved on in the UK. I'm sure it can be improved. In here, it's still really bad. So still room for improvement.
Yes. Thanks, Dunny. It seems like an endless cycle of violence followed by protests that are met with even more violence. On the side of the blue lives the term bad apple, and it's constantly thrown around. So we must ask, do the few that have sparked such large outcry actually represent the many?
Well, that's a good question, Fuad. A report by Nature.com states, based on information from more than 2 million 911 calls to the US cities, it was concluded that white officers dispatched to Black neighborhoods fired their guns 5 times as often as Black officers dispatched for similar calls to the same neighborhoods.
Yeah, and there was also a study published in February that looked at complaints filed against police officers in Chicago, Illinois. It found that although only a small percentage of officers shot at civilians, those who have done so serve as brokers to the social network of policing. So other officers connected with them were also found to be at greater risk of violence. The epidemic of police brutality seems to be contagious, especially when disciplinary reaction is so rarely a match for the crime.
Definitely. And it's made even more difficult by the fact that union contracts give officers protection that have been tied to increases in misconduct. In many states, the Bill of Rights for law enforcement officers shields personnel from investigations into misconduct.
And during these few months of protests, there have been calls to defund the police in the US. They've been met with the response that it would lead to an increase in crime, but that necessarily is not the case.
Yes, actually, the opposite is true. The money that protesters want from the policing budget in their cities would be reinvested into social programs that will target the root causes of crime and poverty, such as homeless services, education, and healthcare.
This actually happened in Austin, Texas, where they cut around $20 million from the police force directly and reallocated $80 million worth out of the law enforcement sector. Chris Harris, the criminal justice director at Texas Appleseed, stated, "By adjusting the police budget, even just a little bit, we are going to be able to house and help hundreds of people with these 2 hotels. And I hope we'll be able to buy more."
So some cities are in fact taking initiative, but unfortunately, it is nowhere near enough. Since the murder of George Floyd, 118 Black Americans have been killed by the police. A complete reform still seems in the distant future, but protesters have not eased up. The individuals taking to the streets are staying true to their mantra of no justice, no peace. Back over to you, Denny.
Now, as reported earlier, tensions in Myanmar continue to rise. The Myanmar military's crackdown on anti-coup protests has displaced close to 250,000 people since February the 1st. Our correspondent Saffron investigates deeper into these tensions.
Thanks, Denny. The streets of Myanmar have been filled with protests since the military took over on the 1st of February. We reported the conflict just after it began over 2 months ago, and since then the situation has become far more severe. Now over 700 citizens have lost their lives, with the deadliest day having 114 people, including 11 children killed. Today I'm speaking to Dr. Nicholas Leeds from the University of Liverpool about the greater social implications of what's currently going on. And he should be coming on live.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, hi, thank you so much for joining us. So we'll just get straight into it. So first off, could you explain in brief the main actors in this conflict and what's actually happened?
The main actors are, on the one hand, the Tatmadaw, so the military of Myanmar, and the National League for Democracy, which is a civilian political party. And the National League for Democracy has been the dominant political party in the country for the past decade, ever since the country started moving back to having democratic elections in 2011. There was another election last year. The National League for Democracy was very successful in that election. And since then, there have been grumblings from the Tatmadaw, from the senior generals in the military. And then, as you said, on February the 1st, the military have seized control of the country and arrested the leadership of the National League for Democracy, alleging large-scale electoral fraud. And that led to large-scale protests by ordinary people in Myanmar, often supporters of the National League for Democracy, often great supporters of Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of that party.
So the situation has definitely escalated quite a lot from that original spark of the military takeover. Are there any other countries that have had similar conflicts in recent years, and how have they played out?
There are similarities to other countries. There are similarities to some of the countries that experienced the effects of the Arab Spring in the Middle East and North Africa. So in those countries, there were democratic uprisings, there were mass peaceful protests demanding the protection of human rights and the movement to some kind of democratic political system. And in some cases, such as Syria and Libya, those protests were met with violence, and the result was those countries spinning into civil wars. And violence is still ongoing in both Libya and in Syria, although in other parts of the Middle East, the authoritarian regime was either able to retain control or it was overthrown, and there was actual progress towards a democratic system, as in Tunisia. So I think absolutely there is a comparison to be made with what happened in the Middle East around a decade ago.
So looking at the social economic factors and obviously all the similarities that predated this conflict, was this military takeover and the protests now, were they bound to happen considering Myanmar's history?
I'm not sure that they were bound to happen or inevitable. In fact, the military takeover on February the 1st caught a lot of people by surprise, including many experts on the country. So one surprising aspect of this was that the Tatmadaw, the military of Myanmar, actually had large-scale control of political developments in the country, because the military had created a constitution in 2008 that meant that as the country moved back to democracy, the military would retain control over key issues relating to national security. And it also secured a large number of seats reserved for representatives of the military in parliament itself. So the military was actually very powerful within the country's political system. And so many have seen the military takeover as quite surprising and possibly even unnecessary, possibly even an overreaction by the senior generals in the country. So although the country has experienced coups before, the turn of events this year have been quite surprising to many observers.
So seeing how intertwined the military is with so many of the political systems in the country, how do you think that they could recover from this?
It's possible that the country could move back to the path it was on, so move back to a path of military-controlled steps towards democracy. I think the military would have to turn around the situation quite fast. It would have to reduce the level of violence that it's using to put down anti-coup protests. It would have to release the leadership of the National League for Democracy and begin some kind of reconciliation process, possibly involving outside intermediaries. So diplomatic representatives from neighboring countries in Southeast Asia, for example.
So again, on the theme of international intervention, because at this stage it is an issue of human rights, what role do international bodies such as the UN have in resolving these conflicts?
The challenge for international organizations like the UN is that if the country in question, if the government and the state in that country resist involvement by an international organization, that limits what that organization can achieve. unless steps are taken to actually engage in some kind of military intervention. But no one's suggesting that in the case of Myanmar. Those kind of forceful interventions are very much unpopular at the moment because of the perception that they haven't been successful at securing human rights and preventing crimes against humanity in recent decades. So there are a lot of challenges there. It's possible, though, that regional actors, such as other countries in Southeast Asia, so acting, for example, through ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, might have more success in acting as brokers between the different factions in Myanmar. And in fact, there's a summit of ASEAN leaders coming up this week on Saturday. And so it will be important to see if any progress can be made by some of the countries that neighbour Myanmar.
Yeah, it does. In my other interviews, they did speak about a sense of solidarity in other countries that have also struggled with getting democracy. So speaking in broader terms, who does hold the power to prevent human rights abuses within a country, given that state sovereignty is ultimately supreme in international law?
State sovereignty is clearly an important legal and political principle. Sovereignty, though, has always been qualified. So sovereignty is the authority of a state to govern within its own territory. But that's often been qualified when a country is governing itself in a way that's causing security problems or instability for its neighbors. That's usually been considered to qualify a country's sovereignty and to justify or legitimate outside involvement. And the situation in Myanmar has become so bad that it might well lead to a flow of refugees outside of the country, which could create problems for neighboring countries in Southeast Asia. So there has long been concern by outside actors for such situations. So that could qualify the principle of sovereignty. In recent years, there have been principles that have sought to address this issue of human rights abuses and crimes against humanity within states. One such notion is the responsibility to protect, or R2P. And in fact, many protesters in Myanmar have called on this idea of R2P. They've called on outside actors, other states, the United Nations, to actually intervene in what's going on in Myanmar. However, as I mentioned, I don't think it's likely that there will be a forceful humanitarian intervention. And so if the government of Myanmar continues to act in a way that infringes the human rights of people in that country, then I think it will fall on diplomatic efforts by actors that have some credibility with the military in Myanmar, and hopefully they'll be able to broker a resolution and a climb down and an end to the escalating violence in the country.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Again, that was Dr. Nicholas Lees.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So we were also able to speak with Jessica Lewin, an international student from Myanmar, about the experience of the people in the country during all of this unrest. Hello, thank you very much for joining us. So obviously most of our listeners and most of the world is on the outside looking in on events like this. So could you just tell us, maybe from the experience of your friends or family, what it feels like to be in Myanmar right now with all of this going on?
I think obviously there's a lot of mixed emotions. I think primarily a lot of people are feeling kind of anger and grief because, you know, we're exposed to a lot of atrocities just on a daily basis. So, you know, for the international community, the Burmese community, we see kind of just atrocities, bleeding people, everything on social media every day. And obviously for the people in the country, you know, they're exposed to it every day, like in front of their eyes. And, you know, I guess a lot of anger at the world for not doing enough to help, I guess. Fear, but, you know, there's some solidarity, like there's some positive, hopeful emotions there as well. It's a mix of things.
Yeah, it's obviously a very, very like emotive situation in general. So us in the international team, we did report on this 2 months ago when they first begun on the 1st of February. At that point, it was just curfews and blocking the internet, which is already horrific, and only a handful of cases of actual like violence that resulted in death. Could you tell us how the situation has changed or progressed since then?
Yeah, so you said you reported, is it back in February? Yeah, so back then, I guess, yeah, there was only a handful of deaths. But from then on, the military began to scale up the violence. You know, kind of initially they started by killing about 10 people a day. And then, you know, arresting protesters at night, or setting houses on fire, and just generally kind of exhausting the protesters so that they wouldn't be able to sleep, you know, just as a tactic. Um, you know, and, you know, it started with kind of arrests of like anyone they deemed as influential or leaders, you know, like celebrities, teachers, singers, everyone. But then obviously after kind of a lack of response from international governments, they started to act more drastically. I think they were kind of using the killing 10 people a day to kind of test what would happen. But then, yeah, due to the inaction, kind of the death tolls starts to reach about 100 a day sometimes. I think that happened once in March and again later on. Then they started, you know, stealing bodies of dead protesters from the graves and performing non-consensual autopsies, torturing political prisoners, releasing the bodies back to the families, etc. And now, you know, as it stands, the death toll is over, I think, 700 people. Like right now, like 4,000 people have been arrested. And the people are still trying to protest with the civil disobedience movement, which I'm not sure if the listeners will know what it is, but it's the workers essentially just strike because they're refusing to work under the military government. And you know, there's protests going on, and that's kind of in aid to the CDM movement, which yeah, like they kind of protest on the streets, and the workers, the civil servants who refuse to work, they're just staying indoors, and that's kind of put the entire country into a halt. You know, it's completely yeah, like everything's completely grinded to a halt in the country. Yeah, I guess most nationally is most recently as well, we've developed a national unity government, which we recognize as our true representative government, but you know, as opposed to the military. So I guess there's some good things coming out, like we're progressing, but you know, overall we're still seeing the violence continue, the deaths continue.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like an absolutely horrific situation, and it's really a testimony to the resilience of the people, if anything. Yeah. So what has the response from the international community been like, and what more do you think they could have done?
Well, there's been a lot of verbal support from each country. You know, like each country's governments have put out condemning statements against the military, and the countries that can have put economic sanctions in place. Like the most supportive countries have been Korea and Australia. Like Korea, they've recently just got their democracy, so their citizens, I think, really sympathize with the whole generational trauma, and you know, they've been protesting on our behalf. And Australia, like I think one of the members of parliament from the Green Party, like they've been like donating funds and like donating food and stuff to the protesters. But otherwise, like I don't think we've experienced much yeah, like action per se. Like the Western world, like they've, I don't know, like I said, they've put out the statements, but you know, they've kind of, I think the Burmese people from the West kind of like they kind of expected like a military intervention or just some form of action. And even though that's unlikely, like they were hopeful. But regardless, you know, because we know that's not going to happen now, I wish they would do something, just, you know, something like the Australian was doing, just kind of either donate or kind of, you know, make it a point to kind of raise awareness, or just kind of give some more time, like airtime on the news, or, you know, just any like donation of funds or anything would be good. And you know, I think there's a lot of disappointment in the UN as well, just because, you know, they were so active in kind of condemning what happened with the Rohingya genocide and stuff in Myanmar. But obviously, you know, we kind of view it as they let it happen, then condemn it after. So yeah, we kind of see that as a repeat of events, basically. You know, they're kind of watching it happen, condemning the military, but letting the same group of people do the same things again, but with the whole country this time. And as for the Southeast Asian countries, we kind of understand that they're in a similar predicament where they have, you know, difficult governments that, you know, kind of support the military. So we weren't, I guess we were hopeful, but not kind of expecting that much help from them. But yeah, like most recently, I think ASEAN, you know, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, they recently invited the military general Min Aung to their meetings instead of our like national unity government representatives. So it's just stuff like that. Like, you know, like countries could be doing a little bit more to kind of not acknowledge the complete power of the military. And obviously if they could spare some donations and funds, like that would be great. Because I feel like even the Burmese community abroad, like we can't really do anything to help. We can't do we can't, protest for them or anything. We can only really send donations and send support. And I think that's the bare minimum we could do. But if kind of other kind of governments and countries could get on board, that would be great. But we haven't really seen that kind of just kind of verbal condemning.
Yeah, it does seem like those who sort of are in similar situations that do have the sympathy and empathy don't necessarily have the resources to help as much, and those who do have the resources are sort of sweeping it under the rug. Yeah, it's such a frustrating situation. I'm sure.
Very helpless.
So we did also previously discuss the Myanmar ambassador being pulled from the UK embassy. Could you sort of explain what the implications of that are?
Yeah, so basically, because the embassy of Myanmar in London not only affects UK citizens, but it's also the kind of like he's also the non-resident ambassador for Sweden, Ireland, and Denmark. So obviously, it means that all of the Burmese people in all of those countries have lost their only representation in they've lost their only representation within their countries. And if any liaisons were to go through that, the new kind of military ambassador, it would mean that they're kind of representing the words of the military instead of the words of the people. And we already kind of had a situation like that when I think early on we didn't really have a representative, and we only had the military spokesperson to go on behalf of all of Myanmar to the UN. And it was really frustrating just kind of watching them perpetuate their own propaganda and kind of give out false statements. And obviously we kind of feel like any liaisons with the ambassador would just be a repeat of that. And I think it's also just the fact that the UK has allowed, they didn't allow this to happen, but the fact that they've allowed the ambassador to basically come in, they've put out a statement kind of acknowledging that they can't really do anything. Like, they acknowledge that the government has put in a new ambassador. To us, that basically means that the UK have acknowledged the power of the new government, right, to kind of have to accept their rules. So yeah, to us it's kind of like Boris Johnson, Dominic Raab, they've all put out statements of condemnation, but when it comes to it, something like this happens to their own land, and then they're not going to do anything about it. They've sent police over to protect the ambassador, to protect the building, tell protesters to go home. And yeah, it just feels like they're kind of keeping the status quo and defending the military and their ambassador and not really doing anything about it when it comes to the land. But it's kind of easy to put out tweets and statements of support and not do anything.
It's quite literally all talk, no action. It's very, very frustrating situation. Did you have any sort of closing thoughts that you wanted to sort of leave our listeners with?
I guess the only thing is I think a lot of the international Burmese community, like I said, we can't do anything. We've been trying our best to raise awareness and kind of advocacy, doing a lot of advocacy on social media. But it's kind of come time that, because international governments and stuff aren't stepping in, we've kind of come to the point where we're kind of having to fund our own defense force and federal army, and kind of because the protesters are striking as well, we have to provide funds for them and provides funds for kind of the people who have been internally displaced, etc. So we're going to have to do a lot of fundraising. So I'd say, hopefully just to the listeners, if I can, just keep an eye out for any fundraising resources and, donate what you can, what you can afford. Because yeah, there's going to be a lot of resources being shared in the next few weeks.
Once again, a big thank you to both our guests, Jessica and Nicholas. Back over to you, Denny.
Thank you, Saffron. That was the latest news from Myanmar. Now, tens of thousands of Russians have rallied in cities across the country in a last-ditch effort to secure the freedom of the jailed opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. The unsanctioned demonstrations have shown the demonstration of Navalny's core supporters, who called for freedom for political prisoners, in tense standoffs with riot police in helmets and body armour. Our correspondent Fuad has more on the latest reports in Russia.
This is from yesterday's protest that took place across Russia. Demonstrators turned out in support of the jailed Putin critic Alexei Navalny, who has been on a hunger strike and is critically ill. Around 1,600 people were arrested across 90 cities around Russia after attending the protests, which had been banned by the federal government.
Navalny was sentenced in February to more than 2 years for parole violations. He said were politically motivated. At the weekend, his doctors warned that Navalny was in danger of a heart attack or kidney failure. The physicians have not been able to visit the activist in prison, but said medical tests provided by his family show that he was dangerously ill and could, quote, die at any moment.
As well as the pro-Navalny demonstrations, there has also been resentment building against Vladimir Putin as protesters chant slogans like "Russia will be free" and "Putin is a thief." This comes at a time when Putin has been on the offensive in terms of his political rhetoric and actions, especially around Russian annexed Crimea and the Ukraine border, where there has been an escalated Russian military presence. He is the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK on Ukraine's response.
Our military is not what was in 2014, so the losses on both sides would be probably enormous. And we hope that Putin also understands it in his calculations. That is not the news he'd like to bring to the Russian families. We will defend our nations ourselves. We need some help, but we eager to put up the real fight.
This escalation is built at a time when Putin warned the West on Wednesday not to cross Russia's red lines, saying Moscow would respond swiftly and harshly to any provocations, and those responsible would regret it. Putin was due on Thursday to meet Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, who has turned to Russia for support amid a wave of protest against his 27-year rule, raising the prospect of closer economic ties and security ties between the two states. The worry in Ukraine is that this move will push Belarus deeper and deeper into the orbit of Russia, which will pose a greater threat to its national security.
Alongside this, Washington has last week tightened sanctions on Russia over accusations of computer hacking and election interference. The Czech Republic also accused Moscow of a role in explosions at an arms depot in 2014. Both expelled Russian diplomats, however, denied wrongdoing and responded with a tit-for-tat expulsion, with both countries now having recalled their ambassadors.
This, along with Navalny's deteriorating condition and the build-up on the Ukrainian border, signifies a new era of tensions where Vladimir Putin seeks to project a message of strength and defiance to friends and foes, both domestic and international. However, despite these tensions, there are indications the two sides still want to engage with one another. Putin, for example, accepted Joe Biden's invitation to a virtual climate summit later this week and is expected to speak. Biden has said he is open to a one-on-one summit with the Russian leader, the results of which may give an indication of what's to come in the future. Back to you, Denny.
Thank you, Fuad. Now that's all we have for today, and a big thanks to all of our guests. I hope you have enjoyed this broadcast from Politics Hour International. We've been your presenters, Duni, Saffron and Fuad.